Serious. People who were at Ground Zero on 9/11, what's your experience? Hi, it's Em. Small trigger warning. I'm sure most of you know 9/11, but if this is a sensitive topic for you, please don't put yourself through this. We will be more than happy to see you in the next video. Story 1. I wasn't at the Ground Zero, but I was at Ground Zero in a sense. I was in middle school at the time, in New York, but my middle school and high school was on top of a hill that on a clear day easily saw the Manhattan skyline. Plus, a huge chunk of my school was made up with families of people who worked in the finance industry, an industry heavily present in the WTC in New York City, including several students who had either brothers, cousins, or parents who worked above the floors where the planes hit. I don't remember the exact numbers, but a giant chunk of my class lost someone. There are certain people you'd never expect to see cry. Bullies, big guys just absolutely lose it. It's honestly hard to write about it without tearing up a bit. The crazy thing was, we could just make out the sky filling up with smoke and obscure the city, like a sideways volcano was about to blow. I just remember as the news broke. For me, it was told to me by a friend who was horribly unreliable, and as such, I didn't believe him. And students would just break down as they realized with certainty that they had someone close to them die. It was a small school. Each grade had a maximum of 150 people, but by the end of the day, there was maybe 50 students left in the whole school who hadn't been taken home for one reason or another. We who were left had all gathered in the auditorium. My dad at the time worked in the top chunk of the Empire State Building. I was terrified that the building would get hit too. It seemed like just as good a target as any. And my dad would definitely be the sort of person who would have just worked through. Instead, he pulled up to pick me up from school in a stretch limo. As he was desperately trying to get out of Manhattan, he made the realization that no one would probably hail a limo. He was mostly right. 2 other people ended up sharing it with him and made the long journey up out through one of the only bridges open in the Bronx and back down into Long Island. Then somebody commented, instead, he pulled up to pick me up from school in a stretch limo. This is such an interesting detail. Very level-headed of him. Yeah, your dad's quick thinking probably got you home as soon as you could. I'm sure, though, it must have been just so sad to know so many people who knew that they had probably lost somebody that day and not knowing how to comfort them. Story 2. My mother was an EMT in northern New Jersey. She did not go, but coordinated her local volunteer first aid squad, deploying a rig into Manhattan. One of her best friends was one of the ones who went. It was very traumatizing for EMTs and other rescue personnel that day, and the days to follow. These people go into a situation with the idea that they're gonna help people. They're at least gonna get them to the hospital alive. After they arrived at the down towers, people still thought at first there would be some people to help under direction of NYPD, and I don't even know who else. They spread out over the pile, trying to find people. At one point, my mom's friend saw a hand poking out and went eagerly running over to it, thinking she'd hold that person's hand while yelling for others to come and dig that person out. She crouched down and held the hand, and very quickly realized there was nothing attached to the hand. That was how things went for rescuers. By that first night, they pretty much knew it was, at best, gonna be a recovery effort, not a rescue. The friend had a full-time job outside the home in addition to her volunteering with the first aid squad. She has not worked at her paying job, nor has she worked as an EMT since that day, and she's been in heavy-duty therapy ever since. Someone commented, I heard that people hide in what was left from the towers for the rescue dogs so they would not only find dead bodies. Because they're not trained to only find dead persons, and I think that's the worst thing to think. Well, we can bring someone to the hospital and rescue their life, but they mostly find dead bodies. Yeah, I read that too. They didn't want the dogs to be sad because they were only finding bodies. So they hid so that the dogs could feel somewhat accomplished. Which is really sweet, but so sad when you think about the fact that they weren't able to do anything like that for the responders. Story 3. It was one of my first memories. A week before I started kindergarten, I was sitting on the couch watching Mary-Kate and Ashley's show. My mom was in the kitchen making a bottle for one of my 2 baby siblings. The phone rang. Suddenly, my show was interrupted. In that moment, I was furious. My mom walked in. She was silent. I remember watching the towers fall. I remember every time I closed my eyes, I'd see them fall. I remember the first day of kindergarten, we sat in a circle and talked about it. I was lucky. I was one of the kids that didn't lose anyone. I don't remember much besides that. My mom told me that for weeks afterwards, I'd build towers and kick them down. My dad worked on Wall Street, but not in the towers. He and his friends helped his pregnant boss down the stairs to their building because their elevators were shut off. This was right after the second tower was hit. By some miracle, they found her a cab. He ran from 8 miles from Wall Street back to our apartment. He didn't see the towers fall. He wasn't raised religiously, but he said that he was scared to look back. He was afraid he'd turn into a pillar of salt. When he got home, the soles of his shoes were worn out. He sat on the couch, head in his hands for hours. I think about it a lot. My fury at the TV interruption, my parents' silence. My family is not American. They didn't want to move to America, and they didn't plan on staying, but they did. Something changed that day. It was like we all suddenly realized that every ounce of control we believed we had over ourselves was a lie. It is so interesting to hear about kids who lived through this, and some of their first initial reactions were that of anger or frustration that their parents were upset, or their day had been shifted. My brother was about 6 when it happened, and my mom still tells us how he was mad that he had to go home early from daycare because he wanted to play with his friends longer, and how my mom struggled not to snap on him because she was so sad and frustrated, but she knew he was so little and didn't understand what happened. Story 4. I watched the second plane hit from across the river in my school's library. It was such a clear day. I knew something was wrong, so I decided to just leave and go home. When the first plane hit, we thought it was an accident. On the way home, I was on the phone with my wife, and she started screaming. The towers collapsed over and over, and I couldn't believe it. In my head, I pictured them falling like dominoes. When I got home, I immediately tried to get in touch with my dad. He worked in WTC and would have definitely been there at the time of the attack. He just so happened to take vacation that week. So lucky. I had tons of friends who worked downtown, and thankfully none of them were injured. Some of them didn't make it home for hours and hours, having to walk across the bridge because public transportation was shut down. My neighbor died in the attack with a 2-year-old and a newborn at home. If they had tried crashing the planes an hour later, it would have been much, much worse. A lot of people don't get to work in the city until 10 or so. I don't like to think about it, and I wasn't even in Manhattan, so I can't even imagine how it affected people who were right there. Somebody commented, "Oh wow, so happy for you and your dad." Story 5. Was on the R train when the first plane hit. Ended up being delayed due to smoke conditions at Cortlandt Street. Got to the office in downtown Brooklyn and saw what was happening on TV. Went up to another office and we watched the towers collapse out the window. My office was close to the Brooklyn Bridge, so the rest of the day was thousands of people covered in ash walking by like zombies. Went out with the bar that night and Bay Ridge with the boys. Every church was packed. It was just surreal. Lots of police and firefighter families in that neighborhood. My dad worked close to Ground Zero and he worked nights. He'd see the trailers they were using to store the bodies in every night. Over the next few years, I walked by Ground Zero hundreds of times for work. It was strange and magnificent in its own freaked up way. You'd be walking on a regular city block and then boom, a crater in the middle of the city. Somebody commented, "I understand what you mean. It's like the destruction after a hurricane, chaotically beautiful and freaked up at the same time." The irony in OP and their friends going to a bar and then nearly everyone else going to a church is a little funny to me, but I guess everyone grieves and deals with things in their own ways. Story 6. Wasn't at Ground Zero, but watched from my corner in Brooklyn. The towers were so massive, they looked like they were down the block on Metropolitan Avenue. It was a nightmare. I became physically ill watching the smoke. Then the fighter jets went overhead, and I thought we were under attack, and God knows what was going to happen next. I ran to my dad's office nearby in Greenpoint and saw the first tower fall. I have chills typing this. I went into denial. I told myself the buildings were evacuated. I refused to believe I just witnessed all those innocent people die. My best friend worked in the financial district. She had to walk over the bridge to Brooklyn where my dad drove us back to Queens. We were in shock. Just the radio on in the car. It was so surreal. So many rumors of a dirty bomb coming next and feared that bridges would be blown up next. The following months were just as trying. I was a student in Gramercy Park, and every day I would pass missing people posters. You knew they wouldn't be found. Someone commented, "That last line gave me chills more than anything else in this thread. Thank you for your story." Story 7. I wasn't, but my uncle was. He worked for Lehman Brothers and could see what was happening from his office. They were evacuated after the second plane, and there was a ton of miscommunication. People saying that the Washington Monument had been hit, that sort of thing. He couldn't get in touch with my aunt because all the lines were busy. When the towers fell, he ran for his life and managed to get out of the way before anything got to him. He wrote a book based on these experiences later on. One of my relatives is a flight attendant for United, but I don't think she was working that day. Another relative was working on the crisis response team for United. He was sent up to Pennsylvania to survey the damage and ended up having to take a bus home to his wife 3 states away because all the planes were grounded. I've talked to him about it since, and while it's fascinating to hear, the impact is profound and damaging. If you ever traveled O'Hare International Airport, there is a banner memorializing the flight crews lost on 9/11. I'm actually near where the planes went down in PA, and my school took a trip there to see the field. And it was so eerily silent the whole time, as we all took the time to process that so many people had died there. Story 8. It was my day off from college. Was sitting about to play a video game when I saw a plane had hit the tower. Didn't think anything of it until I watched that second plane hit the other tower. Got in my car and drove down to my firehouse that I'd been sworn into not 3 weeks before. Staged there for a while and was finally thrown into a truck to stage again at Westchester Fire Training Center. Staged there for what seemed like forever. We get the call that we were to head to Ground Zero to help with search and rescue. The whole area was very surreal. Dust and debris everywhere. It was pretty much organized chaos. I helped wherever I could and still remember the look of confusion and anger on everyone's face. My friend and my chief both told me since I was new not to take my mask off and to only breathe bottled air. Hot change if you needed to. Both of them would end up taking their masks off to smoke. Both of them are no longer with us. Story 9. I was not at Ground Zero 9/11. I was on a USAF base in Milwaukee, just hanging around the shop because none of our 12 C-130 aircraft were broken, so it was normal to stay in the shop and do miscellaneous work. We get a call that a plane hit the first tower. We gathered around the break room TV in time to see the horror of the second plane hitting the second tower. The base went into threat condition black. All gates closed and secured. We quickly assisted the base security forces set up a sandbag fighting position on the roof of the main entrance building. 2 50 caliber machine guns were swiveling at any vehicle coming close to the base. We headed back to the shop and every maintainer was on the flight line getting our mighty C-130s ready for the call. Within a few days, we were airdropping ammo, weapons, troops, and equipment in Afghanistan, ahead of the special operations guys to start kicking butts. I'll never forget how everything changed that day. Story 10. My grandma used to see the towers clear as day from her window, and I wish we took a picture of them. But she stood in shock as she saw both towers fall and couldn't eat for a day or two. The days and years following, I learned a lot about faith, destiny, and even luck, because I didn't know anyone personally who passed away that day. But I knew of people who were supposed to go to work, but was sick. People who were running late. A cousin who was in the high school next to WTC. But luckily was starting freshman year in upstate New York. Friend's parent who's supposed to take the plane that hit the towers, but missed the flight. To all the people who were grieving their loved ones who passed that day, may they never be forgotten. Someone commented, I'm up in Vermont, but one of my classmates' parents was an AA pilot whose route was Boston to LA. Fortunately, he wasn't flying any of those planes. So many people mention how they saw the towers fall, and that little moment was life-altering, as it really was the moment that changed how safe people felt in America. One of those moments where you're grieving others, but it changes how you think about your own safety and life. Story 11. I was in a college psych class in Midtown, heard about what was happening, and went out to look in time to see the second tower fall. Pretty surreal experience. That night, Manhattan was silent aside from an occasional siren, which was eerie. Got evacuated late at night to the river because my dorm was near the Empire State Building, and they thought there might be a threat. I don't remember if it was the night of 9/11 or the following night. Woke up the morning of 9/12, sobbing and despondent. We still thought the death toll might be 10,000 at that point. Things were weird. I went down to Ground Zero to volunteer a few times as a way to deal with it. In some ways, I think I got over it more because I was there and it was actually real. But nobody I knew personally was killed, and it wasn't just an image on a TV screen. Story 12. I was going to school in North New Jersey, and I was in the 5th grade. I remembered I was on my way to school seeing smoke from the window of my bus. I thought it was just a big fire and just ignored it, until I got to my school and our homeroom teacher announced the Twin Towers were struck by a plane, and we were sent home. On the way out from the school, I remember seeing some teachers and kids frantic, as they had relatives or close friends who were there in the area. I was able to just go outside from my grandparents' apartment in Edison and still see the smoke all day. Very wild and sad day. Somebody commented, my mom picked me up from school in Muchin, and I just remember thinking how cool it was that I could hear the planes flying so low. Story 13. My science teacher in 8th grade told us about how she was working at the WTC in Tower 1 and was late to work because she forgot to eat and stopped at McDonald's. The people ordering her food took their time, so she was a few minutes late. When she finally got her food and left, the bridge closed right as she got to it. She showed up to work and saw what was happening right in front of her, as her husband was still in the building on floor 91. He sadly did not make it out alive, but if she hadn't stopped to eat that day, she wouldn't have made it either, and she is the sweetest, most caring person I have ever met in my life. Somebody commented, Oh man, she must have been both relieved and heartbroken. I hope she's okay. Yeah, this story is one where I honestly don't know what outcome I would have preferred if I was in her shoes. At least she was able to keep his legacy and spirit alive every time she talks about him. Story 14. Not my story, but they had an article today about a bunch of twists of dates which kept people from dying that day. One guy was in his office in the towers and a client was having trouble signing in at the front desk down below. Normally that's something his assistant would handle, but she was like 8 months pregnant, so he decided to be nice and go down and handle it himself. He lived. She and everyone else in his office died. They had another woman who lived because she got fired less than 24 hours earlier from Cantor Fitzgerald. They hired her back after the attacks, and she actually never went off the payroll because the HR people who would have processed her firing were killed in the attacks. Story 15. Not my story, but in college, I toured DC with my choir and stayed with a man who worked in the Pentagon on 9/11. He said that the building shook and the lights flickered. But since he was on the opposite side of the building, he and his coworkers didn't know what happened until they were told to evacuate the building. He walked halfway home before finding out what happened. He finished his career at the same desk and still lives a short walk away. Someone commented, standing outside my Arlington middle school, you could smell the burning Pentagon when you stepped outside, a slight smoky tinge in the air. Story 16. I wasn't there, but my dad was. He was in the North Tower with his buddy when the first plane hit. We didn't even receive the news about the planes hitting until around 4 hours later, because we were all sick at home, asleep. I was too young to realize how bad it really was, but it still hurts. I can remember my mom being completely devastated when she received the news that he wasn't coming home. We never got his body back, so he had nothing to bury. Someone commented, I am extremely sorry for your loss. I'm really sorry for your loss too, OP. And I hope your family has been able to come together and heal from the loss. Story 17. I wasn't in New York, but my grandpa was the chief engineer and building manager for the Sears Willis Tower at the time. Everyone in the building was ordered to evacuate since Sears was a very likely target, being the tallest building in the country at the time. My grandpa and his crew were the only people allowed to stay in the building, and he offered his people the option to go home. Only one person went home and the rest stayed. My grandpa is also notorious for not using the phone, so my grandma had some pretty choice words for him when he got home. Story 18. Was across the river in New Jersey and had a late start. I was heading to Long Island but got held up because all the bridges were closed. All the payphones and cell phones were down, so I headed back on Route 80 West. The only vehicles going eastbound were ambulances from every town in northern New Jersey. Dover, Newton, Denville, Hackettstown, and all the rest. It really hit home for me seeing that. I have heard a bunch of stories about people who happened to be running late that day, or just were sick or something else, and they had skipped work, or going into the city. Those moments save their lives, and it's just so wild to think about how many more people could have been hurt or killed. Story 19. I wasn't at Ground Zero, but at my school in Alexandria. The lesser-known crash at the Pentagon felt like an earthquake that lasted for like 15 seconds. The whole city was shaking. Every TV in the school building was turned onto a news channel. Parents were called to pick up the kids. I walked home because I lived 1 block from school.
Please leave your story in the comments. I would love to make a video on them in the future. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe.